Welcome to Skip the Queue, a podcast for people working in or working with visitor attractions. I'm your host, Kelly Molson. Each episode, I speak with industry experts from the attractions world. In today's episode, I speak with Nik Wyness, Head of Marketing and Engagement at the Tank Museum. Nik developed a genius strategy to grow audiences and communities online, which has been phenomenally successful. Listen along to hear how the Tank Museum earned around 25% of a total 6 million turnover from online sources. If you like what you hear, you can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, and all the usual channels by searching Skip the Queue. Nik, I'm very excited to have you on the podcast today. Welcome to Skip the Queue.
Thank you very much for having me.
As ever, I'm going to start with some icebreakers though, and I've got a topical one for you.
Okay.
So last week, the BBC reported that a visitor had broken Jeff Koons' iconic balloon dog sculpture. I know this is awful, isn't it? I'm like, at a high-end art fair in Miami. I want to know, have you ever been told off by security for touching a museum exhibit that you weren't supposed to touch?
Oh, that's a good one. I obviously, work at the Tank Museum. That's why what we're talking about. But I first visited the Tank Museum when I was about 8 years old, and I was a Cub Scout. And this was obviously quite a long time ago, different decade, probably the 80s. And they used to have a little arcade machine in there. I know it's kind of weird, like arcade machines in a museum, but they used to have one of those little kind of like penny pushers.
Oh, yeah, I love those.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hell of a way to lose money. But basically, and that's what happened. We were getting a bit frustrated with this thing. It kind of like hangs over the edge, doesn't it? In a really sort of tempting way. So my friend and I, we couldn't resist giving it a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of a rock. And this guy came out and he told us off. And when I started working at the Tank Museum in 2004, I met the same guy. How funny was that?
Wow. Well, I mean, one, that's lovely. Very high rate of retention of staff at the Tank Museum. So that's a plus. Oh my God. Did he actually recognise you?
No, thankfully not. Otherwise, things could have got different. But I definitely recognised him, that kind of ferocious look in his eye.
That is a brilliant story. My nan, just while we're on the subject of penny machines, because I really like those penny machines. They are a very good way of losing a load of money, but I only go for the 2p ones, right? And then it doesn't feel as bad. High roller, yeah. My nan had a bit of an obsession with those and the grabber machine. So they had a caravan in Walton-on-the-Naze, and she used to spend a lot of time on the old penny slot machines in her day. And I reckon that she might have had a little bit of a nudge of some of those, because she used to win a lot, and you don't win that much on them, do you?
You don't.
I reckon she did a little hit bash, Grandma.
I think everyone must do that from time to time. How could you not? It's so tempting. But I think the trouble is, if you go too far, a little alarm goes off and a man comes out and tells you off.
Especially at the Tank Museum.
Oh,
that is excellent. Thank you for sharing that story. Right, okay, next one. I was going to ask you what your favourite tank is, but I think that'd be quite boring. It'd
be like choosing a favourite child. You can't do that.
I know. Unless you just have one, and then it's easy. What one thing would you make a law that isn't already?
Well, I think it should be law that everyone should visit the Tank Museum more than once a month. More than once a month. There you go.
More than once a month. That's a lot of tanks. Okay, good one. All right, last one. I'm always intrigued by this. I think I'm going to start making this a regular question. I want to know, if you now, or if you did when you were younger, if you had a collection of something.
I've never really been one to collect things. I'm a bit sort of rubbish and a bit lazy. Like I get really into it and then I'll kind of lose interest and want to do. I used to collect stickers and that kind of thing. I remember my sister used to collect key rings, but yeah, I'm not much of a collector. But I know you collect. Is it rubbers? You were telling me.
You've done your research.
Well, no, it's one of bizarrely, it was one of the first things you told me about yourself when we first met. When we grew up at that Edinburgh conference. I thought it was an interesting thing to go in with early, but you did it. And I respect that. So, I mean, I'm sure we have a Tank Museum rubber, and I kind of feel that I should maybe send you one.
I would love that. Yes,
please. The collection. It might even be tank-shaped.
Wow. Also, just for anyone that does meet me in the future, I'm really sorry. So sorry that is what one of my starting lines is. Hey, I've got an 80s rubber collection. Excellent, well done me. Okay, let's move on to your unpopular opinion, Nik.
Okay, so I thought long and hard about this because I have many unpopular opinions. So I'm going to go with this one. And that is, I do not like Twitter. I can't stand Twitter, which is quite ironic given what we're going to be talking about. I know, the shock, the despondency on your face. But hear me out. I've got 3 reasons why I really don't like Twitter. So the first reason is that Twitter, in my opinion, just seems to bring out the absolute worst in people. It's kind of like golf. Have you ever been on a golf course and a normally perfectly rational person can just turn into this kind of like snarling club snapping maniac?
Yeah, you've met my husband. Clearly.
There's plenty like him. I'm probably one of them myself, which is why I don't play golf. But yeah, it just kind of, I don't know, like on Twitter, you can see normal people, or what appear to be at first sight normal people anyway, kind of turn into, vacuous narcissists, all trying to show how clever they are, or how virtuous they are, or how much funnier they are than the other guy. It's kind of like a playground one-upmanship, but it's quite derogatory and quite negative as well, isn't it? Really, it's all sort of a bit sort of unpleasant. And I'm just amazed that there are so many people out there who are willing to spend time arguing with people they've never met on the internet. Surely there has to be more to life. But the second reason is that, and this is the one which has always probably wound me up the most, is that, lazy journalists mistaking what happens on Twitter for actual news, or worse, for actual public opinion, when it's actually neither. And so the fact that journalists do that is it kind of gives all of this rubbish a bigger platform and gives it greater credibility than I think some of it actually deserves. But the third reason I dislike Twitter, and there are many reasons why I think we have an increasingly polarized society, but Twitter is definitely not helping. And I really sort of, one of those general things that we worry about is how what you see on Twitter being kind of sort of manifested in just the greater public discourse. It's just like we've forgotten how to have a disagreement respectfully. Do you know what I mean? Nobody can have an argument these days without, having to sort of play the man, or, take the other person out on every level. There's no, well, I respectfully agree with your opinion, but I, will agree to disagree. There's none of that on Twitter, really, is there? Everyone's basically hacking the other person to death verbally until somebody gets bored and has to get off the bus or something. So for those 3 reasons, and I hate all that abuse of public figures as well, whether it's sort of just general hate or misogyny or racism, all that kind of stuff. And you just think none of these people, well, hopefully none of these people would have the courage to say the things that they'd say on Twitter to another person's face. And I always think that, you should never say something in writing on Twitter or on social media that you wouldn't want to say to their face, because you've got to accept the consequences, right, of the things that you say. And I think people hide behind the anonymity of the internet. I don't think that's healthy. Gosh, that was quite a moralistic rant, but my God, do I feel better.
So it really was, but wow, what a great one. And I really love how in depth you went with your unpopular opinion. I was nodding along there towards the end, because I think that point 3, like, there is a dark side to Twitter, and I was agreeing with you on point 3. I like Twitter and I enjoy it, but I think that I'm probably in my lovely, happy, safe, kind of comfortable bubble there, because I follow really nice people and I engage with lovely people. And actually there is quite a big kind of attractions and heritage and cultural community on Twitter that I feel quite part of. So that all feels very nice. But I absolutely agree with you that there is a dark and destructive side of it, which isn't healthy for anybody to be involved in. I
respectfully disagree with your opinion. There you go. You see, it is possible.
Absolutely. And we're still friends, Nick. You're still going to send me a rubber. I'm still going to start our conversations in strange in weird ways whenever we see each other. Let me know, listeners, what you think about Nick's unpopular opinion. I know a lot of you talk to me on Twitter, so it'd be interesting to hear if you agree. I think you probably agree with both of us. Good place, bad place.
Yeah.
It brings out good in some, bad in some.
Absolutely. I mean, sure, just tweet me.
Tweet Nick. Oh, God, please. Go and tweet Nick. Go and tweet him. Make him respond on the platform that he finds appalling.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just kind of go straight for the abuse.
Great. Okay, Nick, tell us, you work at the Tank Museum. Tell us about your role there and what you do.
Okay, so I, as you've heard, my association with the Tank Museum goes back an awfully long way, from trying to rob arcade machines and to when I first became a paid member of staff, which was in 2004, which was a very long time ago, almost 20 years, which is absolutely terrible. So I first started working there as the PR officer, and this was at the beginning of a very transformational period for the Tank Museum. We were applying for Heritage Lottery funding. There was this big redevelopment project in the offing, and so it was very exciting. It was a very exciting time, and it was great to see the organisation go through this kind of great arc of transformation, which was supported by public money. But what was particularly good about that is it was really successful, and we achieved with that Heritage Lottery funding all of the things that we said we were going to do. So we were bringing more people in, we were really making the subject a lot more accessible to a wider audience. All of those things absolutely fantastic. So it's been a big part of my career. I did leave the Tank Museum back in 2013, and I went to work at a very well-established visitor attraction in another location. But I missed my tanks. I missed my tanks, and the First World War centenaries were coming up as well. And I am quite into my military history, so the opportunity came to go back to the Tank Museum in a very different role, a much more senior role, and I took that opportunity back in 2016, and I haven't looked back. So my role at the Tank Museum, my job title is the head of marketing and engagement, which means I'm head of marketing and engaging things. But in English, what that means is obviously I'm responsible for ensuring that the visitors show up. The Tank Museum is a medium-sized visitor attraction. We have about 200,000 visitors a year when there isn't a pandemic. We have a portfolio of special events. Our big fundraising event every year is Tank Fest, which if you haven't been, you absolutely must. And
top
we
of my
also
list.
have top of that. I'm sure it is. And although I'm surprised you haven't been already.
I haven't been to the Tank Museum.
Well, you'd have the rubber if you did, right?
Well, exactly. It's not in my collection.
There you go. We'll have to put that right. So that's the Tank Museum. I'm responsible for making sure the visitors show up, and all of that kind of external communication, whether that's stakeholder communications, the public relations activity, the media relations activity, and the social media activity, and the e-commerce activity. And a big part of what I've been doing, particularly since I returned, was basically building up these online audiences and building this online community, and latterly of sort of successfully monetizing that, really. And what we've done is create an entirely almost distinct business from, if you like, our visitor on-site income. We've created this separate money-making enterprise, which is all about our online audiences and our online followers and supporters.
This is what I want to talk about today, Nick. So I have heard Nick talk about this the last time I heard you speak was up in Scotland at the Tourism Association's conference, which was incredible. What you've achieved is pretty phenomenal, I have to say, and just so incredibly impressive. And I'm so glad that you've been able to come on and share it with our listeners today. So I think I just want to, I'm not sure if I've got the date right, but was it in 2020 that you started to develop this strategy, or was it pre-pandemic?
It was pre-pandemic, yeah. So it's kind of what I've been working on since I came back in sort of 2016.
Right, okay.
But I wouldn't say what I started working on is where we've ended up. So what we started doing, it was all about basically building up these online audiences. And it was all really about, if I just wind back a bit, one of the problems with the Tank Museum, I say problems, I mean, it's a fantastic location being in Dorset as we are, but we are absolutely in the middle of nowhere. We are in a tiny garrison village of Bovington. The nearest big town is like Bournemouth. That's an hour away by car. So we are absolutely in the middle of nowhere. If it wasn't for the fact that Dorset was a successful domestic tourist destination, there's no way the Tank Museum could have survived at all, really. But because, lots of people come to Dorset on holiday, August has always been our busiest month, for example. So the fact we're out there in the middle of nowhere means we have a real sort of challenge to get people's attention. And so this whole strategy came out of our sort of requirement and our desire to just kind of let people know we existed. And the objective that I set myself was we just needed to be more famous. So everything we did was about making the Tank Museum more famous.
That was it. And that was the key objective for the whole strategy. Love it.
That was literally it. Be more famous, because if people don't know you exist, they're not going to come and visit you. Sure. And so, like I say, I'm kind of from the sort of more PR end of the marketing spectrum. I did like a journalism degree, and I've always been really interested in storytelling. And the Tank Museum is, as you can imagine, we tell stories, and we tell some amazing stories. And warfare is one of those bits of history where you get to see the very best in humanity, but you also get to see the very worst. And so, some of the stories we deal with are just absolutely fascinating. Sometimes there's goodies, there's baddies, and there's loss and love and all of that kind of thing. Really, really good stories. So it's always been, in my view, the case that storytelling, PR, those kind of traditional ways of reaching an audience with stories was going to be the way that we're going to achieve that cut through of making the Tank Museum more famous, making our objects speak for themselves, if you like, and the stories that we tell. And so the strategy really grew out of that PR strategy. And when social media kind of came around and we started to take things like Facebook more seriously back in, I don't know, 2010 or something like that, it was about using social media as a means to reach people without the filter of like the media, if you like. There were specialist magazines and there were national newspapers that we could get the occasional story in, but it'd always be heavily edited to be more in their voice. But social media allowed us to sort of speak with our own voice and get our stories out directly, unfiltered, to a much bigger audience. And we started to see that audience online grow. And basically what we were doing at that point was very much alongside what we were doing offline, as it were. And we started to see that audience grow. And as it grew, it started to become clear that actually the majority of people that we were actually hitting with this weren't British, as in they weren't resident in the UK. And so they were therefore quite unlikely to be able to visit the Tank Museum. And that in itself did pose a bit of a kind of a intellectual dilemma, really, because it's like, if you're putting all that time and effort into reaching people, you want them to visit, but if they're not actually going to visit, well, what's the point of actually reaching them then? You're just kind of making a lot of noise, and it's unsustainable. And so that whole monetization piece came out of this sort of, really, I think, for me, being challenged by the trustees of the Tank Museum to say, well, this has got to pay for itself somehow. How are you going to do it? And if you don't do it, you've got to stop. And so I like a challenge, so I got stuck in.
And you really got stuck in. So I love this. So you achieved your objective, right? So we go back to 2016. You said the objective would be more famous. You drive that objective, and you achieve it over the next few years. But actually, in achieving that objective, it's not bringing in any more revenue to the organisation because your audience is.
Like a lot of PR activity, it can be quite difficult to sort of measure, and it can be quite difficult to track that back to source. So I think the big change for us came when we introduced YouTube to our sort of social media marketing mix. And again, we've got a very visual subject matter. Tanks are big objects and they move, so they look good on camera. And I think I launched the YouTube channel originally, I don't know, it must have been about 2010. I bought a little rubbishy sort of digital camera. And basically for me, the idea of making videos for YouTube was, I just had this idea of doing like visual press releases, basically, because, it might make them a bit more interesting. And we were starting to see at that point, other people were coming to the Tank Museum with camcorders and making little videos, and they were doing quite well. So we thought there was clearly a bit of potential in this. And then as time went on and we kind of introduced what is our sort of flagship YouTube series, which is the Tank Chats, where we have one of our experts literally standing in front of a tank, just talking about that object, the history of that object, how it was developed, blah, blah, blah. And that's what really set our YouTube channel off, was that there was quite, YouTube is quite labor intensive. You need to have the kit, you need to have the people to make the films, and then they need to spend time editing those things as well. So I think at that point, we were getting really, really great views, really, really great engagement. But the reality is we're a charity. We have to be careful how we spend our money. We're not rich. We're, like I say, we're in the middle of nowhere. This all has to go back to some kind of important, box ticking objective. And that has to be sort of financial in some way or other. We have to make sure it's washing its face. And whilst we could see, as the YouTube channel started to grow, sort of 2014, 2015, we could see that we were starting to see more international visitors, for example, rocking up at our special events like Tankfest. And we could see that our experts that we were putting in front of the camera were bizarrely starting to get like people coming up and asking for autographs, which is, kind of adorable in many ways. So we could see that, but you can't really put a figure on that. So like I say, like a lot of PR activity, it's just really difficult to quantify in that way. And we've got a very, switched on group of trustees, and they were basically challenging me to say, well, put a value on this. And it's very difficult unless you find another way of kind of, literally making it clear how it's performing for you.
Okay, so we get to that point and trustees challenge you. How do you, so what did that look like? What did you then start to do, and how did you start to develop the monetisation strategy that you've put in place?
So there was this trustee meeting, and I was very pleased with these massive numbers, because it's all about, on social media, the bigger the numbers, the more successful you are. So I think we were all feeling quite pleased with ourselves about that, and say, look at all these people in America watching us. People have never heard of the Tank Museum have now heard of the Tank Museum. Isn't that great? And in a way, it is great. But they were absolutely right to sort of say, well, hang on a minute. Because actually that intervention has just led to things being better, really. And that's what you want from your trustees, isn't it? But at the time, it probably felt like a little a little bit deflating. Because my first thought was, goodness me, how on earth are we going to do this? Because there's no model in our sector for doing this at all. And normally, if you're short of a good idea or two, there's plenty of other people in our sector, bigger organizations, more established museums, you can just help yourself to an idea from, really, or talk to them and say, well, how have you done it? And, what ideas can we basically steal and reform? But this one, there was nothing. So it was a real challenge, but actually that's what made it fun in a way. And so all I did is, because, I was then, and I still am now, a bit of a YouTube addict. So I definitely think I probably watch more YouTube than Netflix, and certainly much more than terrestrial television. I just like the variety and the randomness of the things you can see. And my son, who's only 8 years old, is, much to my disappointment, equally addicted to Netflix. But he spends hours watching people play Minecraft. And what is that about? How is that enjoyable? And they're all quite irritating as well, but that's by the by. This isn't a therapy session, I must remind myself.
Get it all out. Get it all out.
Right, anyway, back to monetisation. So what I did is I had a look at YouTubers and how they were making a living effectively from just running a YouTube channel. And, that became a thing, if you like, sort of 2012, 2013, 2014. And it was just literally a case of saying, right, how are they making their money? And identified there was 4 key ways in which they were making their money. The first thing was through advertising revenue. So when you are on YouTube and you're playing your videos, Google basically puts ads at the beginning of those videos, and I'm sure you've seen them. I'm sure you've skipped many of them as well. And basically they do operate a revenue share scheme with their creators. So you basically get a percentage of every ad that's played. So the second thing is memberships. So Patreon had just launched at that time, and Patreon is like an online modern membership, a platform which allows you to facilitate an online modern membership scheme. And it's very closely linked to YouTube at that time. YouTube kind of endorsed it, and a lot of YouTubers were using it as well as a means to provide sort of tiered memberships where people could give, monthly micro donations, whether it was $1 a month, $3 a month, $5 a month or more, in exchange for a tiered set of benefits, whether that's additional access to the creator, early access, that sort of thing. The third way was through sponsorships, and I'm sure we've all seen YouTube videos where at the beginning of the video, no matter what it's about, there might be somebody who's promoting a product, whether that's like a VPN service or a pair of gaming headphones or whatnot. And the final way was merchandise sales. And even people with modest YouTube channels will be using Printly or something like that to print their own t-shirts with their channel logo on it. So basically using those four methods, that's how we sort of built the strategy around kind of making it happen. And ad revenue is all about the more views you get, the more ads get served to your content, and the more money you can make. So to give you an example, last year we had about 22 million views, and we earned £90,000 from ads, and that's it's not an immaterial sum of money. It's it's completely passive as well. Once it's out there, you don't have to do anything apart from just kind of take the payment every month. And the other thing about that was really interesting to us as well was that what we saw is that the overseas audience, particularly the American-based viewers, were actually a lot more lucrative than the UK-based viewers. So in last year, about 30% of our viewers were based in the USA, and the ad revenue, basically 45% of our total ad revenue, originated from those American viewers, because the ad market is much more developed on YouTube in the USA than it is in the UK. So the UK viewers contributed just 20% of our total views, which is, of course, a lot lower as a proportion than the USA, but just 23% of our ad revenue. So you can see it was actually a benefit all of a sudden to having these American-based viewers.
Wow.
And you can see how, in the future, it might be beneficial for us to actually, aim our content a little bit more at the American audience for that very reason, which is quite interesting.
Gosh, that's fascinating. I can't believe the numbers on that as well for passive income. That's incredible.
Yeah, and that's not even that. From what you can earn, that's not particularly stellar either. I have to say, there are people who do much more kind of commercial content than we do, because ours is very much educational, who would probably do a lot better than that. Like the guys who make those Minecraft videos that my son watches are probably absolutely coining it in, which really makes you question your life choices, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, it does.
So yeah, and then we launched our Patreon, and again, that was just a case of setting up the platform and then signposting it in all of our videos, basically saying, if you want to support the town, it's easy for us. We're a charity, so if you like, the ask is a lot more straightforward. Support our work, help us keep the channel going. We were able to eventually fund an internship using the earnings from Patreon. It built up to such, I think it was just over £20,000 after the first couple of years. So we went to our local arts university and brought in a graduate placement who had just graduated from the film studies course to help us make more content. So it became sort of beautifully self-fulfilling.
And that's wonderful that you could do that as well.
Yeah, and it was all funded by the Patreons. And then we work with partners to generate sponsorship income. I think because we're a charity and because we're a museum, we're not going to just accept any old sponsorship opportunity that wanders by. We have to be a bit sort of careful about our brand and who we'll work with and that sort of thing. But we're already working with a video games company called Wargaming. They make a video game called World of Tanks, which I'm sure you're an avid player of yourself.
Of course.
And I needn't introduce it any further. But basically, it's one of those massively multiplayer. It's free to play online, and basically what you do is you kind of drive around in a tank and you sort of shoot at other people who are driving around online in their tank. Played by literally millions of people worldwide, and they're already sponsoring like exhibitions and events at the Tank Museum. So it wasn't really a big leap for them to start sponsoring our online content as well. And a really good example of how their sort of support and sponsorship for our online content on our YouTube channel in particular could be found in 2020 during the pandemic, as I'm sure you can remember all too well. We weren't able that summer to hold our Tankfest event because obviously everything was shut down, which left us with a real big problem because, of course, Tankfest is our biggest fundraising event of the year. So we were able to use our YouTube channel and a bunch of edited footage to bring a Tankfest 2020 live stream to the internet with World of Tanks' financial support. So they basically gave us the sponsorship to kind of bring in the technology to, live stream this stuff that we'd edited together, which was sort of live hosted, and create a live stream. And, that video did really well. It's had over 1 million views and still growing now, which is quite remarkable. We, from that live stream, gained £50,000 worth of additional donations from the viewer base, and it led to an additional £20,000 of sales in our online shop that weekend as well. So, it was staggeringly successful for us, but we wouldn't have been able to do it without World of Tanks' support. So,
gosh, that is an amazing achievement. So just thinking about what you said about the pandemic there and not being able to do certain things because of it, but then being able to do this quite transformative project. Did the pandemic speed up some of the things that you were going to do, or were these things kind of naturally in progress anyway as the pandemic hit?
I think we were lucky in the sense that a lot of this stuff was just starting to get rolling when the pandemic hit. The fact it existed when the pandemic hit, no question about it. I think it saved jobs at the Tank Museum, no question about it. And I think that's a really good news story, isn't it, at the end of the day? We were already in a place where we built these really big online audiences into a sort of a loyal community of almost advocates. And so when we were asking them for help, they were happy to support us, So, we saw an increase in our patronage during the pandemic. We saw an increase in ad revenue as well, because across the board, more people had more time to sit and watch YouTube videos. And obviously, we worked with World of Tanks on that occasion to do this kind of big set piece live stream special event, which yielded great results. But probably for us, the most important thing and the biggest chunk of our online income comes from e-commerce. And so the fact that when the pandemic hit, we actually had the time for the first time ever to really focus in on e-commerce and make it work, get it sorted out, get the website sorted out, sort out our logistics. And during the pandemic in 2019, we took £120,000 in our online shop, which we were quite happy with. In 2020, we took £1.2 million.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. And, we wouldn't have been able to take that if we hadn't already built this enormous online audience organically. So sure, we were using, we were advertising the products and that kind of stuff online during 2020. But the fact is that we kind of went in from a sort of a running start, because the audience was there. The product selection was there. We knew what we were doing and what we wanted to achieve. We just actually had time to get on with it. And actually, there's nothing like a crisis of that sort to really focus the mind and for everyone to be pulling out the stops. It was a fantastic team effort.
Oh, absolutely. It's amazing what you can achieve when you're under that kind of pressure, and you've got nothing to lose, right? There really is. There's no barriers there. You've got absolutely nothing to lose by doing it.
Nothing else to interfere with with it either.
There's no people. We don't have to worry about them.
There's no visitors. Yeah.
What has that? So was that a one-off, or has that continued since? This big increase in your online sales.
So I think for us, that was always the concern, wasn't it? And I'm sure a lot of e-commerce, of course, saw a massive boom because there was literally nothing to do all day apart from watch YouTube and buy stuff on the internet.
Drink gin.
So we were obviously worried that how will things be in 2021? Is this just a blip? Is this just a bit of an anomaly? So we did 1.2 million in 2020. In 2021, we did same, I think 2.1 million again. So we were like, well, that's interesting, but it's been a funny year. There's still lots of COVID hangover. We were locked down at the beginning of the year. So for us, 2022, the year just gone, was a real test for us. It was, this was going to tell us whether or not we'd managed to create sustainable growth. And actually last year we did 1.4 million. So it was a huge effort. We had to work really, really hard for it. But we were far better set up for that. We've increased the size of the team to cope with this. But actually, what we've shown is that we've got some really good foundations here, and some really good foundations for future growth as well. So it wasn't just. That was the concern. It could have all fallen away last year, and we would have been sort of sat wondering what we were going to do with all these people who were sat on their hands. But fortunately, it's so far at least, knock on wood, has shown to be holding up.
And is that the same with some of the other things as well? So is that the same with like your YouTube views, and has everything stayed the same or increased since then?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was for us. I think the big thing in 2022 was about basically kind of stepping back and letting your hands off and going, right, is this still there? Is it still happening? So we didn't set like massively ambitious targets for 2022. It was all just about is it okay? But yeah, we still continued. We had, I think, 22 million views last year, which was 2 million more than the one before. The membership income was, it was £2,000 more than it was the previous year. So what we saw is a lot of people who signed up to support us during the pandemic, when the pandemic was over, kind of fell away, but that's fine. We also know that people have been hit by the sort of the upheaval in financial and the financial uncertainty. So we've certainly lost a few, but we've had to work hard to gain a few as well. And our sponsors, Wargaming, have sort of stuck by us as well, and the e-commerce, as I've just said, has continued to work really well. We had an incredibly strong Christmas season, and we've continued to do some of the things that we started doing in 2020 as well, like these self-published books, where we've got the audience, we can sell direct to them. So what we do is we'll take a book that's out of print that we've got the rights to. We know we can be relatively comfortable that we'll be able to shift 3,000 or 4,000 of those, based on the fact that we've got this really loyal audience in a real niche. We don't have a great deal of competition for that niche, and those have been really good for us as well.
Wow.
really good things to drive sales and bring in the customers. Yeah.
Are your trustees happy? That's what I want to know.
They're never
Are they
happy. And, I don't want them to be happy either, because if they're happy, that just makes life easier. They're always pushing us to try new things and just try and push it a little bit further. But that's why the Tank Museum, I believe the Tank Museum is very successful, because we get the finger in the back. Just you can't get comfortable, you can't get complacent, and that's the way I like it. That's why I like working at the Tank Museum.
Yeah, it's a good place. That's a good place to be, isn't it? Where you're always challenged, so there's always more that you can do. You said earlier about the attraction sector is one that is incredibly supportive of each other, and you mentioned earlier that there's normally a model or someone's done what you're trying to achieve, and you can often go and ask people. But in this case, you are the model, right? You
Right.
have developed the model. So what would be your tips for other museums that are looking to implement a really similar strategy to this?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's a good question. I guess part of the issue is we never really set out to implement the model. It kind of just awkwardly fell in this way. But I'm always looking at what other, whether it's attractions or museums in particular, really are doing in this space, and how they're trying to do it. And I often wonder why there are much bigger, more established organisations than ours that aren't doing better than us. And I kind of feel like they arguably could be. I do think there's an issue that I haven't met at the Museum, because I've always had a lot of support from particularly, my director, who's just kind of let me get on with it. And it's a bit of a smaller organisation as well, so working cross-functionally is a little bit labyrinth, and it's easier to get things done in a smaller organisations. You can be a bit more nimble. But I think a lot of the reason for our success really goes down to this sort of obsession with really getting to know the audience and really sort of cherishing them, so you can really understand what they want, and then you give them what they want. So it's not really rocket science at that point. If you know the audience, and we've got a niche audience, obviously people who are into tanks, they're quite easily defined, aren't they? Is it a tank? Yes, I like it. Is it not a tank? No, don't like that. So we don't talk about sharks or fish or anything like that. But the other thing I think that's made us successful is we, throughout the course of this journey, because we didn't set out to achieve everything all in one go, we didn't realize we were doing it at the time, sure, but we've got these really strong and consistent online brand values. So I've always thought that the content we produce, anything we put on social media, it has to be useful. It's got to give the audience, something interesting, something they actually want. It's got to satisfy a need. And we give them, hopefully, interesting stories and engaging facts, and you've got to lay off on the sales on your social media, really, haven't you? It's a long game. You've got to earn the right to sell to people, if by giving them lots of useful sort of free stuff. I think it's really important that organisations on social media are authentic to their own sort of organisational voice, and not trying to be something else, not trying to follow what other people are doing necessarily. You've got to kind of cut your own path. I think being original is really important. There's no point trying to imitate what others are doing. I don't think it would be seemly for the Tank Museum to be trying to sort of imitate other online influencers with the kind of things that they do, because that's not us. We're the Tank Museum. We're trying to be serious content creators, and we've got a serious message. I think simplicity is important, and I mean simplicity in terms of sustainability to create, because we're not a massive team, but we have this requirement now to put a video out on YouTube every week, and actually that can be quite labor intensive, so you need to make sure that you're not trying to achieve more than you actually can. And of course the content needs to be good, simple, and what I mean by that really is easy for the audience to consume. Those would be my tips, really. Gosh, there's quite a few there. There's a lot there. I don't even know. I don't even
how this has happened.
I have no idea what happened.
They're really good tips, though, and if I'm honest, so they're tips that I took away. So I have heard you talk about this a couple of times now, Nick, and I've taken those tips away, and I've implemented them, or I've tried to implement them for Rubber Cheese ourselves. So I think that there were a few things that we were already doing, but I think just coming back to those every time, the be useful, that everything that you push out has to be useful, is so vital. And that's the one takeaway that I took from your talk, is that if you are anything that you're trying to do on social media, whether you're trying to grow your audience or grow your presence or your brand or sell something, but not in a salesy way. It's just about being useful. Like what can we do what do we know that would really be helpful for our audience? Just share that stuff, and that for me is the biggest takeaway from the things that you do is about being useful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not useful to anybody, is it? But we're not after anybody. We're online. We're particularly after that niche audience of, enthusiasts. But because it's online, there's lots and lots and lots of them scattered all around the world. The Tank Museum itself, and this is one of the really key things that I've really kind of really grasped, and it's difficult to get other people to understand, is that the online audience, particularly for the Tank Museum, is totally different to the on-site audience, and that's how I want it to be. So the on-site audience is all about being, accessible to the widest possible, group of people who are in Dorset and able to visit. We want families to visit. We want older people to visit. We want younger people to visit. We want schools to visit. But online, we're just going for those sort of military history aficionados, and you can see that, if you like, in the actual demographics of the audience. So I think, like, on site, our gender split is 60% men and 40% female, which actually I think, we need to do better on, if I'm being honest.
That's not bad, though. I wouldn't have said that was too bad for what seems quite stereotypically male.
Absolutely, yeah, and it has got better. But the reality is, actually, for me, is actually the subject matter of the Tank Museum really is, particularly the way it is presented in recent times, because we've completely redone the entire museum. There is no reason why anybody could come to the Tank Museum and say, "There was nothing in here for me," because we just tell really good, fascinating stories, really. So you don't have to be someone who cares a great deal about tanks to get something out of the Tank Museum. But you do have to be someone who cares about tanks to get something out about online content, and that's the way we want it. So online, our audience is 90% male, maybe more, probably more, if I'm being honest. And it's also very, very international. We probably struggle to get 10, 12% international visitors onto the Tank Museum site. It goes up during our special events, but not by much, probably to 20%. And we know that our online audience is probably 20, 25% UK. The biggest single segment would be North America, so that's USA and Canada. And what's left is everywhere else. And we've got Europeans, Australians, South Americans. It's a very global audience, and that's the thing with niche audiences. A niche audience in the UK is not so small when you take it to a global scale, and that's why this strategy is able to succeed at scale financially.
And that it all comes back to what you said right at the beginning: know your audience.
Know your audience, absolutely.
Brilliant advice.
And care about them.
Yeah, not just know, care. Exactly. Okay, what is next for the Tank Museum? What can you share with us that's coming up? What other ideas have you got in the tank?
I like it. You're
welcome.
Well, I think, for us, the biggest thing is, we have to focus on COVID recovery. Last year wasn't horrendous, but we know that there are further headwinds. We know that there's a bit of an economic uncertainty at the moment. We're not quite sure how that's going to affect us on the door. We are very heavily dependent on the Tank Museum site, at least, on the vagaries of sort of UK domestic tourism. So there is a bit of wait and see. This year we'll see the first normal Tank Fest since 2019, because we've had to reduce the numbers, or we've had to operate it in a very, very different way. And that event is so very important for us. But I think on the online side, I think, there's still so much that, I'd love to do if only there was the time and the resource to do it. We want to get better at doing this stuff. We want to get better at the community development side of things. I think that's obviously, going to be the future. And I mean that in its broadest sense, from starting with growing the amount of emails that, engaged email subscribers that we have, and kind of, nudging them up that fabled ladder of loyalty. We want to increase the output of our content. So one of the big things that we did last year was launch a TikTok channel, because TikTok is where the younger people are, and you've got to think about the future in terms of getting your brand in front of the younger audience, because just because they're young and they're on TikTok doesn't mean that among that will be people who are interested in military history. It's not all about sort of funny dances and twerking, although that's a good part of it, I'm sure. So, yeah, if you're on TikTok, check out Fan the Tank Man, who is our in-house TikToker. He did really well last year. He only launched the channel in like late April, and he's accumulated 271,000 followers and 51 million views last year, which I think is pretty impressive. He's doing really, really well.
That is phenomenal. I'm not on TikTok because it's another thing that I've got to learn and understand and find time for. So I'm not on it yet. I need to be. I do need to understand it. But that is a really big achievement in such a short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shows that there is an appetite for serious military history content. And of course, we change, if you like, the tone of voice that we're using, and we change the conventions that we're using in the kind of presentational sense. But the messages are still the same. The stories are still the same. Do you know what I mean? So there's still that consistency of authority and kind of our authenticity coming out through TikTok, even though it's a very different approach and a very different audience to our YouTube channel, which is 45 plus, I suppose, its biggest contingent. With TikTok, we know that the biggest audience is 18 to 25. So it's really important, isn't it, to find a different avenue and a different way of communicating with different generations. I mean, that's basic marketing, isn't it, really? But the other thing we really want to do, and I really hope we get to do it this year, is launch a second YouTube channel. And the reason we want to do that, again, it's part of this audience diversification piece. We've done really well targeting that really hardcore of sort of armored warfare history enthusiasts. But we want to go a little bit broader than that. We want to sort of almost use a second YouTube channel as like a funnel to the main one, if you like, by telling more broader stories about people and events, whereas our current main YouTube channel is very much focused on sort of objects and things and stuff, if you know what I mean.
So why set up the second one out of interest? Do you feel like you would dilute the first one if you put those kind of stories on there?
Yeah, I think it's about because we've got some 477,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel at the moment, and so since the channel has launched, particularly in the last sort of 7 years, we've really given them a very strict diet of very strict kind of very in-depth tanky information. So that's that audience. That's what that audience likes. It really is that kind of granularity they like, and they do prefer, generally speaking, those stories about the stuff, like the objects. It's more kind of perhaps more engineering, more development, less about human history. Perhaps at times we go there, but not very much. This is mainly about the kind of the machines and the objects, really. So with this second channel, we are looking to tell more interesting stories about what happened when, and the artifacts are obviously a big part of that, but this is more about the human story side.
Yeah, and that's the kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that would appeal more to me than the real kind of specific. So again, it's looking at broadening that audience online to. Yeah. Gotcha. Brilliant. Great advice. Great achievements. I'm so glad that you've been able to come on and share this with us today. Thank you. No, thank you very much for having me. It's always great to get out the Tank Museum and have a chat with people. Well, before you go, we always ask our listeners if they've got a book that they love that they'd like to share. So I had a look at what your other speakers and guests had recommended. I thought, oh, goodness me, there's lots of really worthy choices in there. And I'm not really one of those people who particularly enjoys reading those like management strategy books. I was like, in my own free time, I want to read for fun. And obviously a bit of a nerd of military history. And there's interestingly a bit of an overlap, I suppose you could say, between sort of like military and marketing. We use a lot of the same terminology like strategy and tactics and deployment and cut through and all of that sort of thing. So I'm going to recommend a book which kind of overlaps a little bit with a professional with the military history. Okay. And that book is quite an old book, actually. It's called Hal Moore on Leadership, Winning When Outgunned and Outmanned. And basically, Hal Moore was an officer in the US Army. He's died a few years ago, I think. But I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. It's a Mel Gibson movie. It came out in 2002 called We Were Soldiers. Have you ever come across that one? No. Okay, it's quite a good film. But basically, it's a Vietnam War movie. And basically, the star was this Hal Moore guy. It was a biopic. And it was about the first major engagement in the Vietnam War between the US Army and the North Vietnamese Army. And basically, his unit, 400
blokes were dropped in the jungle by helicopter. They quickly found themselves surrounded by like 4,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, and they found themselves cut off and basically having to fight off the determined and repeated attacks. And basically Hal Moore keeps his unit together through this tremendous series of challenges. And so that book is all about his perspective on leadership and what he learned during his military career. And actually I've worked with several ex-soldiers, and actually what you learn from soldiers is that the military is one thing that they're really good at, and they're very good at many things, is training leadership, if you know what I mean, and training people how to be a good leader. And I don't think that's something that the civilian world and the business world is actually very, very good in. But what's interesting as well that I've learned from these former soldiers that I've worked with is you get a completely different perspective from them, particularly those who have seen sort of action or any form of operational deployment on things like resilience and what tenacity is and what courage is, and even what stress is and what a bad day in the office is like. Because of course a bad day in the office at the Tank Museum is nothing like a bad day in the office on a front line somewhere unpleasant in the world. So that perspective I think is really useful. But Hal Moore comes up with these four principles of leadership, which is the theme of the book. The first one is that the battle is something like the battle only stops when you stop fighting, which basically means don't give up. It doesn't matter what you're facing, you've got to keep going. A bit like Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. And the second one was that when you're in a tight spot, there's always one more thing you can do to influence the situation positively in your favor. And that's about being proactive, right? Because when you're in a tough spot, the worst thing you can do is nothing, is freeze. You've got to be proactive and you've got to keep going. And the third thing was, if there's nothing wrong, there's something wrong. So basically what that means is, don't be complacent, keep your guard up, be alert. And I think, there are times when you're running, marketing campaigns when you can, you almost think, well, everything's going all right. But actually, that's probably when you need to check in on things the most. And the last one was to trust your instincts. But basically he argues that, you're well trained, you've got plenty of experience, and so is your gut. And the other thing is that, so you should listen to it. And the other thing, of course, is your subconscious is much more observant than you will ever be. So, so never be, as marketers, we're very analytical. We like to look at our data and that kind of thing. But your gut can tell you if you're interpreting that data correctly or if you need to look at it again.
Gosh, what a book. Wow. I've never heard of that book. Never been recommended before as well. So that's a great one. Maybe you'll come back on in a year from now and tell us how 2023 went and how the first Tank Fest since pre-pandemic went.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. If my hair has gone completely grey by that point, you'll know it wasn't a great year.
I'm sure it's going to be a good year. Thanks ever so much for coming on, Nick. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Skip the Queue. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find us. And remember to follow us on Twitter for your chance to win the books that have been mentioned. Skip the Queue is brought to you by Rubber Cheese, a digital agency that builds remarkable systems and websites for attractions that helps them increase their visitor numbers. You can find show notes and transcriptions from this episode and more over on our website, rubbercheese.com/podcast.